Hello, and a very warm welcome to episode 3 of Shards of Illumination. I'm your host, Paul, and in the hot seat, as always, is Mr. Ralph Ellis. Hello, Ralph, how are you?
Yes, Rabbi Ralph Ellis today. Yeah, I've
Oh,
got
I
a new
didn't see
pronoun
that
here, so
yet. Brilliant. Okay,
I keep swapping between one and another, but we're allowed to be anybody nowadays. So yeah,
exactly. Muscle top.
sort of,
Okay
yeah.
then. So we're going to cut this show, Ralph, into two parts today. In the second half of the show, we're going to be looking at your forthcoming tour of Egypt with Megalithomania, which looks very, very exciting. But in the first half, we're going to have a response to another hit piece done by the Gnostic Informant channel
Mm.
about 5 or 6 days ago, I think. He even mentioned me in it, believe it or not. Evidently, I should be thoroughly ashamed of myself. So there we are. Anyway, I'm not. I'm very proud to be sitting next to Ralph, just for the record. So there we go.
Yes,
Right.
you should be really ashamed at having your own independent opinions and thoughts.
Exactly. I
It's
know. I should
terrible.
just, yeah, believe what academia tells me and never question anything. What am I doing? Okay. Right. Are you ready to get started? Because we've got three.
Yes,
We've got.
let's go because some of these are quick and simple, so we can run through a
Okay.
few of these, I think,
Yeah.
fairly
Well,
quickly.
I count 21
Oh, is
accusations
it that
and
many?
distortions. Yep. So
Yeah.
let's kick it off with this one, Ralph. Gnostic says Cleopatra did not have ginger hair.
Yeah, and you wonder why he wants to try and denigrate me about something which is patently true. So, sort of gives us the idea that he's never read my books or read any of my work on Facebook or anywhere else, because it's as plain as it could be that Cleopatra did have ginger hair. And this is not me saying this. This was identified by Dr. Joanne Fletcher. She's big on women in history, and she does a lot to do with, funnily enough, hair. It's one of her main topics that she looks into. And anyway, she found a couple of images of Cleopatra from Herculaneum, which is interesting because they're very old. Of course, Herculaneum was covered in volcanic dust in AD 79, wasn't it? So these are very early images, within sort of 70, 60, 70 years of the death of Cleopatra. And they show her to be ginger. So why would anyone try and denigrate myself for saying that Cleopatra was ginger? Just does not make sense. It's absolute lunacy.
Yeah. Shooting the messenger, really, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah. Go and complain to Joanne Fletcher, not myself.
Okay, so we've quickly dealt with that one. The next,
Yes.
the next one, Gnostic says the islands off the Florida coast are sinking.
Yes, this was paired with the opposite of this, which is the sea levels in Scandinavia are going down, which he didn't believe. So I wonder if I can do a quick screen share, and I'll bring up so I want to do a window. Which window do I want? I want this window. There we go. So if I share that with you, and you can see that now, can you?
Yep, it's on screen.
That's coming through. Oh yes, I can see it now. Doesn't always show up immediately. Yes. What do we have here? Oh, yes, we do have Cleopatra. This is one of the images from Herculaneum. So you can see that, quite clearly she has ginger hair. And if I just swap across to the next one, this is the other image. Oh, let's make that a bit bigger. There we go. And again, you can see she's got ginger hair. So yes, go and argue with the guy who painted those in Herculaneum in probably, I don't know, the early first century, AD 20 or something, AD 40. Yes. So yes, we were looking at sea levels. So sea levels in Florida rising, which he was complaining about, and complaining about because he doesn't know anything about the subject, which is why I've termed him as being Gnostic the Gormless. Because why would you debate a subject you know nothing about? And then furthermore say that a learned fellow, and I hope that I'm a learned fellow, who's studied this for 40 years. I've been studying climate every day of my job for the last 40 years, and I've written a climate paper. And yet Gnostic the Gormless comes along and says, oh, I know better, even though I've never studied any climate in my life, and I don't know what the hell I'm talking about. But I'm going to criticize this guy. You think, why on earth would you do that? It's almost a sort of like a religious calling, isn't it? You know, where you think you think you're above everybody else because you have the inner workings and word of God. But anyway, what do we have here on the screen? We have the sea level for Stockholm, which is interesting because sea levels in Stockholm are going down. And quite obviously, the Gormless one didn't know anything about that. And why is it going down? Well, this was a bit of a trick question because I was having a go at Greta the Gremlin, who was complaining about sea level rises and how it was going to inundate her homeland. And quite obviously, the reverse is true. Scandinavia, the whole of Scandinavia, the sea levels are dropping. Why are they doing so? This is because of isostatic rebound, they call it, after the ice ages. So this has nothing to do with climate whatsoever. So the complaint was moot. And why would you complain about something which is obviously has come from a respected source? So if he bothered to look at the bottom, it says PS MSL, which is the it's the data center in Liverpool, which holds all of the data for the world sea levels in all of the ports. So this is a respected source, and they hold the sea record here for Stockholm, which goes back to 1890. So we've got 130 years of data here, showing a decrease in sea levels of 4 millimeters per year. So quite a lot, actually. And why is it going down? Well, it's because the land levels are rising. So if we look at the next image, this is just a quick diagram of what isostatic rebound is. So on the top image, we have this great lump of ice during the ice ages, which was heavy. I mean, this was 3 kilometers thick, and it was depressing the land level because it was so heavy. And it pushed it down an incredible amount, actually. It was something like 800 meters. That's an awful lot of depression of a solid piece of land. The whole of Scandinavia went down by 800 meters. Wow. And then in the bottom picture, you can see the ice has gone and the land now is beginning to rise up again. And obviously when the ice sheets disappeared, this movement was quite rapid. But it's still going on. So we still have this upward movement of the land mass in Scandinavia. But it's still going on. It's obviously slowed down quite a lot, but it's still going on, and it's still rising at 4 millimeters a year. And that's why sea levels in Scandinavia are decreasing. Conversely, these lithic plates, the plates upon which the continents sit, they sort of act, I suppose, a little bit like a seesaw, you might say. So if the land is rising in the north, it actually sinks a little bit in the south. So while Scandinavia is rising, southern England and the Netherlands and places like that are actually going down. So they have sea level rise, not simply because of sea level rise, but because the land is actually falling. So the land is rising in the north and descending in the south. And the same happens in America because they had bigger ice sheets across America. So the land around Canada is all rising, but the land around Florida is gently sinking. And so, yes, that's the reason why we have sinking lands in the south of America. But I mean, there's lots of other reasons as well, which I won't go into in a big detail, but we have a lot of man-made sinking in these areas. So there's lots of areas around Florida where they've built a lot of these high-rise flats on previously boggy peaty land. And those heavy blocks of flats are actually depressing the land by about 2 millimeters a year. The land is going down. If you look around New Orleans, that is due because that's on a sort of like a river delta, so it's all silty ground. And they're pumping out water. They've been pumping out water for ages, which they obviously use for agricultural purposes and so on. But if you pump out the water, and if you pump out the gas and the oil, which they've been doing in that region, well, the land falls. And so New Orleans is going down by a considerable amount. I think it's more like about 20 millimeters a year. It's sinking because of all the ground extraction of all the materials underground. So there's lots of reasons. Oh, and the worst one, just while we're here, is Mexico City. Mexico City, again, because of groundwater extraction and whatever, and the weight of the city, and the fact it was built on they built it on a lake, Mexico City, which is probably not the best place to build your city. But anyway, Mexico City at present is going down by 200 millimeters a year. That's like 20 inches.
Wow, that's incredible.
It's almost like going down in a lift, you know. I mean, it will stabilize at some point. It's been doing this for the last, 50, 80 years. It's been going down like that. But they reckon it'll go down something like 30 meters before it stabilizes. And if the land is sinking, in Florida or New Orleans or whatever, it will appear as if the seas are rising. And that is one of the reasons why, we have the data that we do, that, places around Florida actually have sea level rise. It's not all due to climate, but unfortunately the Gormless one doesn't understand that. So
yeah, what a surprise. It's actually far more complex than we're told.
Oh, hugely complex. Yeah.
That doesn't surprise me at all.
Yeah.
Okay, moving on, Ralph. The next one is Ellis said tropical cyclones are reducing.
Yes. Funny I should say that, isn't it? Because it happens to be true. Surprise, surprise. Listeners who are not familiar with my work should understand that I take all of my information from respected sources. The only thing I tend to do, which other researchers don't necessarily do, is I reinterpret them sometimes where they need reinterpreting, especially with the historical data. People have read these manuscripts rather too literally sometimes. Sometimes we need to look deeper into what they're actually saying. But as far as climate is concerned, well, as I've said before, I've written a climate paper myself, which is peer reviewed. The Gormless one came along and said, well, Ellis's paper was rejected. Yeah, but most papers are rejected on the first on the first run at peer review, because that's the nature of peer review. That's the whole point of it. They reject and say, oh, we don't like this and we don't like that. Please correct and send it back in again, which is exactly what happened. So it passed on the second occasion. So yes, so this data comes from it's actually a new paper. This was from Declining Tropical Cyclone Frequency Under Global Warming by Chan et al. 1922? No, 2022. It was about 6 weeks ago. This paper came out. And what they've done is they've gone through all of the proxy data from mainly from ships. So ships have been reporting cyclone activity across the oceans for more than a century, and they collated all of this and made an estimate of the number of cyclones. And the result of that was the graph I showed. So I don't know if you can pull up that graph. There we go. So this was the headline graph from that particular paper, and it gives, along the bottom there, it gives the, can you see my, yes, you can see my cursor at the bottom, yeah. From 1850 all the way through to 2020, and it shows that the number of tropical cyclones, this is worldwide, so hurricanes and typhoons, increased up until 1900 and then have been decreasing ever since, which is interesting because that's the complete opposite of what we are regularly told. We're always being told that it's our fault, that these things are getting worse and worse. And in fact, when we look at this data, it's getting better and better. They've decreased. If you look, it goes from about 110. This is annual numbers of tropical cyclones, from about 110 in 1900 down to about 80, 85 currently.
Yep.
So that is a reduction of 20%. In the number of tropical cyclones. And I've got other graphs which I put on my Facebook and so on from Dr. Ryan Mao, who does the satellite data. So that only goes from 1976, I think, because that was the start of the satellite record. And his data shows very much the same. So if we look at this from 1970s, which is about there, and his satellite data shows the same, that they went up a little bit during the 80s, 90s, and have been going down again ever since. And that is the truth of the matter from respected sources. So Ryan Mao takes all of his data from the satellite record from NASA. This comes from, as I say, comes from Chan et al., Declining Tropical Cyclone Frequency Under Global Warming. And you can look that up. It's online. There's a PDF, free PDF, so you can read the paper yourself. So don't believe me. Read the paper, but just beware that some people are making up criticisms that don't exist, which is very strange.
Okay.
Yes.
I'll link those papers underneath the video, Ralph.
Yeah, I'll send the links over to you. Yes.
Thanks.
I'll do that.
Brilliant. Okay. Right, this is an interesting one. You're in trouble now, Mr. Ellis. Ellis said COVID is fake.
Well, I'm not entirely sure if we're. Yes, I'm not entirely sure if we're even allowed to talk about that now, and that was the problem. I mean, that was the whole point of the articles they put out. Was nothing to do with whether it's fake. We know COVID is real. The main things we don't know about it is where it came from, how it was derived, and how we should really treat it wasn't asked very much as well. So they were the three main points I was discussing, because initially, as everybody probably knows, we weren't allowed to discuss this. You were not allowed to say that this virus might have come from a lab over in China somewhere.
Well, there was one in Wuhan, wasn't there? That was what's it called? A certain level. It was a top level.
Oh yes, it was a grade 5 one. I was trying not to say the name because I don't want you to get demonetized. You see.
Oh yeah, I think we might be right with Wuhan, but if we talk about certain therapeutics, we might have to be a bit more careful with our language. Certainly.
This is the bizarre nature of the modern world, that we have these important problems and decisions that need to be made, and we cannot talk about them. And for a long time, you couldn't even mention the name of Wuhan. You would get demonetized. You would get banned by all of these platforms just for mentioning it. That it might have come from the biological laboratory that happens to be there. And those are the questions I was asking, of course. No one was denying that COVID exists, which was an utterly ridiculous thing to say. So I suppose you would call this the perfect straw man, isn't it? You invent something that you say Ellis said, and then you criticize that thing that you've just invented. That is the basis of a straw man argument, isn't it? It's exactly what he did, because I never said that. What I was saying, of course, is we should have been able to discuss where this came from, because if people don't know, when COVID first came along, the first paper that was released about COVID said that the spike proteins looked suspiciously man-made, because they were exact same sequences that they had been using in the laboratory as test articles. And they found those very, very same sequences on the spike proteins of COVID, which is why they initially said this looks suspiciously like something that's appeared from a laboratory. And then the other problem was that they never found the zoonotic. The alternative theory was it came out of nature from some sort of animal, and they proposed 3 or 4 different animals. Now with SARS-CoV-1, which was like about 12 years ago or something now, they found the host, the animal host, within about 2 months. With COVID, they have never found the host. So we know it was not zoonotic. It didn't come from the wet market. All they found was the bats, which happened to be 2,000 kilometers away, long flying, long endurance bats, I think, flying south, which happened to be in that laboratory because they were studying those particular bats. But it wasn't the same virus. It was a very similar virus, but it wasn't the same. And so something had changed from bat to human, something had changed. And the question then was, could that change have happened without going through another animal to, naturally change the actual COVID virus? And the answer of most people at the time was no. You would have to have some sort of gain of function in a laboratory to mutate it into a version that will live in a human host, because the bat virus will not live in a human host. It's not adapted for humans. So something changed between the bat and the human version. And that's what we were not allowed to discuss for almost a year, I think. You would get thrown off any platform for discussing it. And that was almost criminal. And that's the point I was trying to make. So if people want to know, perhaps you can just bring up this image. This is an interesting book. Yeah, this is an Australian lady, Sherry Markson, and she wrote this book. And she wrote this about nearly a year ago now. So this is quite early on, pointing fingers at where fingers should have been pointing in the first place. And we weren't allowed to talk about it. So yeah, this is the problem with the likes of the Gormless one, because he wants to shut down any discussion of these important topics because of various isms or whatever. There are certain things, according to him, you're not allowed to discuss, even though they are important things that affect all of our lives, like being locked in your house for 2 years because of this particular virus. You're not allowed to question it. No, you're not allowed to question it. You're not allowed to research it. You're not allowed to check if the authorities are actually telling the truth or not. Nope, you're not allowed to do that. Not according to the Gormless one. So the guy is actually dangerous, I would say. I would say he's highly dangerous.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Just on the subject of lockdowns, Ralph, I always maintained during the whole thing that really people that were fit and healthy and of a working age should never have been locked down. We're going to be paying the price for these lockdowns for decades, if not longer, you know. So would you concur with that at all?
Oh, fully agree. It was apparent from the first month of this virus that it didn't affect young, fit people. They should have known this, and this is why we should have been able to discuss this more within the media, within science, within politics. This virus first came to notoriety on the cruise ships, where there was a cruise ship which, it decimated people on the cruise ship, and everyone was going, "Oh, this is terrible! There's people dying left, right, and center." But on the cruise ship, one thing they were not mentioning within the media, but I knew it because the data was there. If you bothered to go and look it up, it was only affecting the passengers, not the crew.
Right.
Now, what's the difference there? And so I had to think around a little bit to start with, because, there were two major differences. The passengers were all American, whereas the crew were all sort of like Indonesian and Filipinos and whatever. Is that the difference? Well, it's possible, but we could investigate. What's the other difference? Yes, all the passengers were pensioners.
Yeah.
And all of the crew were young and fit. Is that the difference?
Of course.
So they should have known this from like the first month of this virus coming out. And then why on earth exactly as you say, why treat everybody the same and lock everybody down?
Well, I must say, Ralph, that when they first did that, it came to my mind fairly quickly. I wonder if this is some sort of rehearsal or conditioning for future climate change lockdowns.
Well, I've probably said on this channel before, I don't like conspiracy theories, but it was
just a question. It was just a question in my mind. That's all.
Yeah, I know. No, I fully agree with you in this format, because it was handled so badly. How else can you judge it? It has all the hallmarks of a conspiracy theory. If not, these people in charge, the politicians, must be the most incompetent people in the whole world. So whichever way it is, you're screwed.
Yeah, absolutely.
So yeah, if you say conspiracy, I'd have to say, there's a high chance that you're probably correct, even though I don't like to mention it.
Whoops, sorry.
Yeah.
Right, let's move on then. So the next one, Ralph Ellis is obsessed with DNA.
Obsessed. Yeah, it's terrible, isn't it? Why? Yes. Why does he want to be obsessed with DNA? Why can't we question DNA? Is this another reason, these taboo subjects, because it's tricky, because it involves culture and society and things like that, you're not allowed to mention DNA. Well, actually, in my books, I don't mention DNA at all, really. So, he's obviously not read my books, even though I sent all of my books to the Gormless one, which he's never thanked me for. So he got 3 books, I think, in the series, in the New Testament series. Cleopatra to Christ, King Jesus, and Jesus, King of Odessa. He's never said thank you for that, but there we go. That's the sort of person he is. But if he had read those books, he would know that I don't really mention DNA. But the other point is, why can't we actually mention DNA? Why is he trying to ban us? Because there's some interesting information that we can find from this. There was a very nice paper out in Nature magazine, which is the British scientific magazine, in 2010-11, which is good. And this was all to do with the Amarna dynasty, King Tutankhamun and the rest of it. and it showed that the mummies KV55 and KV35YL, the younger lady, were husband and wife, brother and sister, so another sibling marriage as usual. So they were brother and sisters, and they were the parents of Tutankhamun. So not Nefertiti. She's not related to Tutankhamun. KV55, some people still say that's Akhenaten. I still think they're wrong, because KV55 is too young, in my estimation, from the reports I've read. I think KV55 is probably Pharaoh Smenkhkare, who was the pharaoh who reigned after Akhenaten. But anyway, so we have these two mummies, which were previously unidentified, KV55 and KV35, the younger lady, who appeared to be the parents of Tutankhamun. I think that's interesting. So, and that all came from DNA analysis. Why don't we want to do that? It also might show us who the younger lady was. So she was found in the tomb alongside the wife of Amenhotep III. What's her name? Tia, isn't it? So the younger lady next door to her could have been Bekhetaten. She was a daughter of Amenhotep III, who always appears in the imagery of Amana. Or they say possibly Kia, who was the second wife of Akhenaten. Now, that's interesting because many years ago when I wrote my Scotera, I think, Egyptian Queen of the Scots, I said that Bekhetaten was Kia, the same person. That's a heresy, of course, because you're never allowed to say that, two names of the same person. But the reason I said that was because Bekhetaten was always in the imagery of Amana, but as soon as Kia comes along, she disappears. So I was wondering if that when she married Akhenaten, which Kia obviously did, maybe she changed her name at that point, and she was now known as Kia. But anyway, that's the sort of things that we can find out when we have DNA analysis, and we don't have numbskulls trying to ban things like DNA analysis. It's interesting stuff.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I wish we could do some more of that. I must actually, because this is 2011. This is 10 years ago. There has been some more DNA analysis since then, and so that's probably worthy of a closer look in another book, perhaps.
Yeah, fabulous. Okay. I think we've covered this one. Ellis said that the number of strong tornadoes is decreasing.
Yes, well, not typhoons this time. This was tornadoes. So if you just bring, if you bring up my graph again, why would you comment on something you know nothing about? This isn't just the Gormless one that does this. There's a lot of people in the sort of recent years from the new generation seem to be doing this. They pontificate from a position of ignorance without knowing anything about the subject and presume that they are correct because they've listened to CNN and MSNBC as being the oracles of the truth. Therefore, they know the truth. Therefore, you are wrong. And they don't seem to realize that if they bother to look at the bottom of this graph, down the bottom, it says NOAA, Storm Prediction Center. This is where the data comes from. It comes from NOAA, the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Authority. It's the data center for all of this information in America. So on the bottom, we've got from 1952 on the left all the way through to 2019 on the right, which is the latest data we get. And this is strong tornadoes, F3 to F5. These are all the strong ones, the ones that really cause the problems in America. And as you can see, the number of these strong tornadoes has been decreasing for 70 years.
Mm.
And the question is, why don't people know about this? This information is easy to find. It's online. You just need to go onto the NOAA website and the information is there.
Doesn't fit the narrative, does it, Ralph?
Doesn't fit the narrative. But, as I've said on a few occasions, that's the whole point of the media. That's their job. They speak truth to power, as they like to say, and they correct people within politics or science or religion or whatever. If they are telling lies, that's their job, is to go around looking for people who are deliberately misleading the world, the people, the population, and correct them if they are lying to us. But here, they have never bothered to correct the scientists and the politicians who have been peddling this misinformation. In fact, they've been their cheerleader all the way through this, saying that, these tornadoes, they're getting worse, they're getting worse. You can see it with the recent typhoon they've had, the hurricane in Florida. Oh, it was climate change. Well, no, the information doesn't back that up whatsoever. That reporter on CNN got very upset when the scientist he was talking to would not agree with him that it was all due to climate, which I was glad that particular, well, he wasn't a scientist, he was a weather forecaster. And he said, well, there's too little information to actually say that. You can't say that. This was talking to Don Lemon, who's probably the worst cheerleader for the agenda that we could possibly get. But yeah, this is the real data. If any decent, fair-minded reporter downloaded this data, they could see the truth. They could put it on the front of their newspaper or their TV reports, and we would all know the truth. But we don't, and therefore gullible people, get hoodwinked, like the Gormless one, and they think that tornadoes are getting worse, and they're not. They're getting better. Strange, isn't it?
Yeah. So, sorry to be conspiratorial again, Ralph, but do you have you heard the rumor that the Club of Rome invented the idea of climate change?
Yes. There have been rumors and there have been conspiracies because, again, same as before, while I don't like to invoke conspiracies, the misinformation we've got on this is so comprehensive that where else can you go to with this misinformation? It's almost inviting you to say it's a conspiracy because the information is, all of the information is completely the opposite of what they're telling us. And that's the only thing I don't like about this being a conspiracy, is that all of the mainstream voices are on message somehow. So not just one channel, but, half a dozen, no more than that, a dozen or 24 channels across the world. So it's not just America, this is going across to ABC in Australia and the equivalent up in Canada and so on. And our old dear old BBC, who is always on message with the agenda. You've got an awful lot of outlets all on the same agenda. And the question is, how could you do that with a conspiracy, with so many people going along with it? Yet the evidence suggests that is exactly what's happening. Because none of these media companies will actually come out and give us the truth.
Yeah, there's actually video footage of world leaders and politicians in various parliaments around the world within a day or two of 9/11, and they're all saying and reading exactly the same script.
They've been doing that on a lot of subjects, haven't they?
Yeah. So of course you have to wonder, don't you? If you see things like that, you think, well, hold on a minute. How can they all have exactly the same script
Yeah,
within a matter of a day or two of the event happening? I mean, it's very odd, I think, personally, you know.
it is. Well, we know how some of this happens because I was just trying to quickly look it up. I can't find it now. I'll have to give you a link later on. But anyway,
Mhm.
there was a meeting. I think it was the BBC 26. This is going back a bit. This is going back like 12, 15 years or more. And the BBC held a meeting of 26 top scientists at which they decided that they would never put the alternative viewpoint on climate on any BBC program anywhere. And it was decided at this meeting that that would be the policy of the BBC. And then someone got in a Freedom of Information Act, which was pushed back, and they had to do this 5 or 6 times. And they finally got the list of the members of this meeting. And of course, there was only 2 scientists there. The rest of them were all sort of, media reporters and um, activists and all these sort of people were a part of this group who made this important decision never to challenge the climate narrative.
Mm.
And that was like 15 years ago or more. And the BBC have held to that ever since.
Mm.
But it was bogus because virtually no scientists were actually there
Mm.
at that meeting.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that's how it happens.
It is, and I mean, climate change is tied in very closely to the Great Reset. And again, I'm not being a conspiracy theorist here. Klaus Schwab has written a book
Yes,
called The Great Reset. He talks about it at the WEF
yes.
all the time. So we're not making any of this up. And
And King Charlie Boy does as well. He talks
yeah,
about it all the time.
yeah. So, and I think it's all tied in towards creating a one world government.
It could be. I mean, there were a lot of people who have been trying for that. I, as it were, infiltrated a few Labour Party conferences at one point and was talking to people. And there were a lot of people there. These are the sort of liberal, rich Labour people. They're not sort of trade unionists
Mm.
who were
Maybe.
very much a part of this one world conspiracy, as it were. They wanted a one world government.
Mm.
And they were avid that that is the
Mm.
way the world should go. And I questioned them about this, and they were more than adamant. They were quite happy that Europe would gain another billion people from the rest of the world in immigration, which would be catastrophic for Europe, of course.
Mm.
And their answer to that was, if that's what it takes to get a one world government, we would be happy to see that Europe is destroyed.
Mm.
And that was their attitude.
Mm.
So, yeah, for the sake of their beliefs and their agenda, they don't give a damn about the people of Europe.
Mm.
So, yeah, they're dangerous people, some of these people.
Absolutely. Okay, let's move on. Ellis says Pharaoh Ramesses II had ginger hair.
Yes, strange, I would say that, isn't it?
That's because it's been proven, isn't it?
Yes. Yeah, if you bring up his picture there, that is Ramesses II, and you can see his ginger hair. And that's real ginger hair. That's not something to do with the mummification process, because his body was taken to Paris for preservation, and it was examined by Professor Caldi, who said that Ramesses was a ginger-haired Symmetrica leucoderma, which means a pale-skinned man with wavy ginger hair. And that was determined not through DNA, as some people are saying. That was determined by the by the proteins in the hair. There are two types of menelin, and based on the ratios of these two types of menelin, you get, blonde hair or ginger hair or dark hair or brown hair. And so it was determined that this was real ginger hair. And that comes from, if you want to look it up, it's online, although it's actually difficult to find. It's not exactly the first thing in the search term that comes up. Bulletin l'Académie de Médecine in Paris, volume 171, page 119, January 1987. So that's going back a little bit. So yeah, it's the truth. And what, again, you've got to ask yourself, why would someone be criticizing me for just telling the truth? Don't shoot the messenger, chaps. This was done by a professor in Paris who determined this. But what these people are saying is, you cannot have that information. We have that information, it's online, but don't you dare tell people that. I mean, that's the attitude of these people. It's quite bizarre. They seem to be saying this based on sort of some racial profiling, which makes the Gormless one a racist, basically. Saying that people in Syria and the East cannot be ginger, but this is Mohammed al-Yaqubi.
Sorry, Ralph, but I think, isn't it about 3 or 4% of people in those areas like Syria have ginger hair? So it's around that sort of figure, I'm sure of it.
Far as I know, yes. There are quite a number of gingers knocking around that part of the world, based on the fact that many of the Egyptian pharaohs were in fact ginger. Cleopatra was ginger, as we've seen. I know she has Macedonian blood, but if you go up to Greece, the natural tendency there is for black hair, yet the monarchy happened to be more ginger, of course, which is why we get this strand of ginger. And this guy is exactly the same. This is supposed to be a direct descendant of Muhammad al-Yaqubi. And he comes from Syria. And what does he look like? He looks like a Scotsman. Pale-skinned with wavy ginger hair, exactly the same as Ramesses II. Now, I don't know if there's any genetic links there at all. I don't know what the links would be between pharaohs of Egypt and the ancestry of Muhammad. I have no idea. I don't even know how important Muhammad would have been, whether he would have been linked to any royal dynasty. I sort of doubt it. But anyway, he obviously had ginger hair. And we've got another one while we're here. Of course, we've got this guy. This is the leader of the Jewish revolt. This is Bar Kamsa. Oh, that's not the best of pictures, is it? It's a bit grainy. Anyway, that's what he looks like. This comes from the Talmud, and this guy in the Talmud, who is giving the sacrificial calf here to the high priest of Jerusalem, in the Talmud, he is called Bar Kamsa, the son of Kamsa. And he was blamed for the destruction of the temple and the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70, i.e. this guy and his army, you can see a couple of his soldiers behind there, was the leader of the Jewish revolt. And so at the very least, we also have another Syrian here, because this guy, I say, was based in Odessa. We have another guy from the Near East who is most definitely ginger, and he's got a Jewish payot as well, a wavy side lock of hair, indicating that he is Jewish. Can we see it? Well, it's not a very good image, is it? But anyway, I think you can just about see that. He's got a side lock of hair.
So,
and he's
Ralph,
Yep.
Sorry, Ralph, I was going to ask you, why isn't this guy Alexander the Great?
Yes. Yeah, well, because Jody Magnus, who was the professor on site at this dig, because this has only come up in the last 5 years or so. This was only discovered. It's at the Hokok dig at the Hokok synagogue. It was just northwest of Galilee. And she said this was Alexander the Great. But of course, it's not Alexander the Great, because Alexander the Great didn't have a beard. He's never shown with a beard. He would not have worn a Jewish side lock of hair. He wasn't Alexander the Great Jew. And his army was not defeated. You can't see it in this. But if I zoom out a little bit here, oh no, that wasn't supposed to happen. Underneath this image, there is another register underneath showing that this army was defeated. So he has an army here with elephants. They're just off the side of the picture here. But the army in the next register below is shown being destroyed, with all of the horses and the elephants on their backs, having been killed. Alexander the Great was never defeated in Judea. So quite plainly, this is obviously not Alexander the Great.
And also, Gnostic says that he thinks it's either Alexander the Great or Antiochus.
Yeah, again, he's going from the establishment. There was a paper obviously came out about this dig after they found this mosaic, which I've read the paper as well, and they said, yes, it could be, there's two Antiochuses. It could, Antiochus the sixth and the fourth, I think, who were kings, as it were, of Judea and the Near East. And there was an Antiochus that had a battle there, and the Antiochus kings did have elephants. Some of them had elephants, war elephants. So there are some similarities with the identification of Antiochus, but I can't imagine this is Antiochus. Because Antiochus would not be wearing a payot, a Jewish side lock of hair. They were not Jews, of course. They would not be identifying themselves as Jews. They are never recorded as giving a sacrificial calf to the high priest of Jerusalem, which this king is doing. He's giving a sacrificial calf. That's never recorded for any of the Antiochus monarchs. And the Antiochus monarchs wouldn't have been wearing stockings. It's probably difficult to see on this, but the king here has darker legs than all of the priests, as if they're trying to tell us, they're trying to color this guy as wearing stockings. Why would they do that? Well, because the Easterners, the Parthians and the Edessans, they always wore stockings. That's why they called them saccopodes, people with stockings on their legs, which the Romans and the Greeks never did. So again, this wouldn't be Antiochus. He wouldn't have worn stockings. And again, we've got the problem with the army being defeated underneath, which is not really a part of the Antiochus story. So there are many reasons for not thinking this is not Antiochus. But if you go to the Talmud, we have the story of this king, who is known as Bar Kamsa, giving a sacrificial calf to the high priest of Jerusalem in order to start the Jewish revolt. So this would have been AD 65 or something of that nature. And of course, this king was defeated. This was the Jewish revolt. This king at the end of this war, 4 years later, was defeated and he was crucified. It fits the story exactly. And the problem I didn't like about this is when I contacted the archaeologists on site, they didn't seem to know about the story of Bar Kamsa, which is odd because these are supposed to be Judaic scholars. Archaeologists, yeah, historians, yes, but also Judaic scholars. And they didn't seem to have read the Talmud, and they didn't know anything about Bar Kamsa. The reply I had was rather sort of scathing. I wonder if I can just quickly pick it up. I didn't. Magnus was her name, Jody Magnus. I wonder if I can pick it up. She says, "Thank you for sharing your thoughts, Mr. Ellis. Because the figures are not labeled, they are open to multiple interpretations, and I'm sure that everyone will have their favorite. Well, okay, that's I thought that was rather dismissive, because it was quite apparent that she didn't know the Bar Kamsa story. So there was no acknowledgement that actually this fits the Bar Kamsa story very closely, that she didn't know about it beforehand. There was no thank you, I didn't know about the Bar Kamsa story. And yes, I'm not sure if there's a trace of embarrassment there that she didn't know the story. But anyway, this is what a good reason why anyone reading these academic papers, you need to read fairly critically, because being an academic doesn't mean you're guaranteed to be correct. These are big subjects. I have sympathy with them. It's a very big subject. Maybe you don't know the entire subject, and therefore you don't know all of the possible permutations. It's like when I was talking to Professor Marciak, who wrote a book about Adyabeni, and I was talking to him. I was in correspondence while he was writing this book, and he didn't know that the Queen of Adyabeni was married to the King of Odessa, because he had not come across that before. And he seemed rather surprised, and he doubted it, and I gave him references. The thing I really didn't like about it is when the book came out, he didn't amend his story at all. So he never mentions the fact that the Queen of Adyabeni is married to the King of Odessa.
That's very interesting.
Yeah, so he completely ignored it, even though after I told him about it. And so he never included Odessa within his book on Adyabeni. And then you'll get people like Gnostic the Gormless saying, well, Marciak never mentions Odessa being linked to Adyabeni. Well, yeah, because that particular academic has chosen not to, even though he was advised that there is a link. And okay, even if you want to dismiss that link, surely you would mention it and then give the reasons why you want to dismiss it, because you don't believe it. But that wasn't done. So yeah, that's academia for you.
Yeah. We'll keep the picture up, I think, because the next one is Gnostic says that Bar Kamsa did not cause the Jewish revolt.
Yes.
So, yeah.
Yeah. Again, if you're going to criticize someone, read the text, read my book, because it's obviously in my book. That's the whole point of writing a book. Don't criticize from a position of absolute ignorance. And it plainly says it in the Talmud. The Talmud says the destruction of Jerusalem came through a Kamsa and a Bar Kamsa in this fashion. And then it goes on to explain the story of this guy and his sacrificial calf, which was given to the high priest of Jerusalem, which he knew would be rejected. That's why he did it in the first place. Because it was a calf that came from Nero, and therefore he was going to upset Nero, who was going to get mad and maybe attack Judea. This was all a political ploy, of course. And then at the end of this, long tract, it says, and the guy who rejected the calf was Rabbi Zechariah, of course. So the Talmud says, through the scrupulousness of Rabbi Zechariah, our house has been destroyed, our temple burnt, and we ourselves have been exiled from our land. They're talking about the Jewish revolt here, because the temple was destroyed after the Jewish revolt. So we can date this exactly to AD 70. And who was blamed for destroying the temple? Well, it was Bar Kamsa. So yeah, he was completely wrong on that again.
So when the Talmud says Kamsa and Bar Kamsa, is that father and son?
Yes, yeah, Kamsa and a Bar Kamsa. I linked this up to Yeah, father and son. So if we're talking about Odessa, we'd be talking about a King Akbaris and a King Manu, a father and a son.
Yeah.
They make this link because Kamsa was their friend, but Bar Kamsa was not. So there was a difference in the generations.
Oh, interesting.
One was friendly to them, the other was not.
Okay. Right, we'll just take that off the screen and we'll move straight to the next one, which is Ellis said that Adyabeni is Odessa.
Yes, we've really been through this, so I won't
Yeah.
labour this at all. The fact is that the Queen of Adyabeni, Queen Helena, was married to King Abgarus of Odessa. So there is a definite link there. Whether you want to say these two provinces were linked by a royal alliance, or whether you want to say they're the same, or whether you want to say that that monarchy ruled both regions together, matters not. It doesn't change the Odessa gospel theory at all. It just means that their realms are rather bigger than we might think. The reason I reject this and I say that Adyabeni is Odessa is that Adyabeni is too far down into Parthia. And later on, you get these Roman historians saying that the Roman army went down to Adyabeni and conquered Adyabeni, and they became Parthicus, the conquerors of Parthia. And you're thinking to yourself, well, no Roman army is going to go that far down into Parthia, all the way down to Mosul, and not be confronted with the Parthian with the Parthian army, which was one of the most effective and powerful armies in the region at this time. I don't think that's going to happen, which is one of the reasons for rejecting Adyabeni as being down by Mosul, which is why I think that Adyabeni is Odessa. I don't think the Roman army could have done that. What I think they were doing is they were going to Odessa stroke Adyabeni combined, and they were doing a tax collecting expedition, collecting some taxes from Odessa, going back to Rome and saying, hey, we conquered Parthia, when they had done no such thing. I mean, who in Rome was going to be able to contradict them? I mean, they didn't have communications very much in those days. You had to rely on what the generals were saying, who had been there and actually been on that campaign. And I think they were just exaggerating, basically.
Yeah. The Josephus mentions Adyabeni on several occasions, but
he does.
Odessa not once ever, which
Yes.
is extremely, extremely strange and odd, isn't it? Really.
Absolutely. Considering Odessa was much closer, and we know from other texts that it was much more intimately connected with Judea and with the gospel texts, because the king appears in Acts of the Apostles as Agabus. And the Odessan army was active in Judea. We have that from Moses of Corinne, that the Odessan army did go down to Judea and attack Herod Antipas. That was in Josephus's backyard. He should have known all about that. Whereas Adyabeni is over at Mosul. He doesn't necessarily have to know anything about Adyabeni whatsoever. It's a long, long way away. He should have known everything pretty much about Odessa. And yet, as you say, he never mentions his Odessa or its monarchy once. It's highly suspicious, isn't it? Highly suspicious.
Absolutely. Right, let's move on. Gnostic says that the Adiabenians were actually Arabs, quoting Plutarch and Tacitus.
Yes, we come on to the multiple names here. They're trying to refute here Odessa as being involved in all of this, because they are saying that the Adiabenians were supposed to be Arabs, I suppose, because they're out in Mesopotamia, but that's not really Arabia. But there you go. There are some historians which say that they were Arabs. It's my contention, and this is where original research comes in. Don't just read these ancient manuscripts and just believe them. Try and make logical deductions from them. It's my contention that the name Arab is just a derogatory nickname. It's a pseudonym, because time and time again these people are called locusts. So Arab means locusts. It's just another meaning of the name. Kamsa, the guy we've been talking about, Bar Kamsa, his name means locust for the same reason. In Acts of the Apostles, he's called Agabus. Agabus means locust. And I think what they're doing is they're just making up derogatory pseudonyms for these people because they don't like them. Rome said that these people have to be deleted from history because Rome didn't like them because they started the Jewish revolt. And so they're just denigrating them. They're calling them locusts because they are equating them with the locusts of the plagues. So the locusts during the plagues, they came out of the east and they destroyed Egypt, and they sent the Jews, or the Israelites as it were, on to an exodus. And this royal family did exactly the same. They came out of the east, they caused a war in Judea, and they sent all of the Jews on another exodus from the Jewish revolt. And I think that's why they're calling them locusts. So, yeah, we can dismiss, I think, any mention from the Romans and Josephus that these people were Arabs. I don't think that's what they were talking about.
Absolutely.
So, yeah, it's a good example of why we shouldn't just believe everything that's said within these ancient manuscripts.
Right, you ready for this one? Ellis said Jesus was white.
Why does everything have to be about race in the modern era?
Exactly.
Why have things changed that there are certain isms you're no longer allowed to talk about when this would have been, just standard history only a few decades ago? But now they want to make everything contentious. And the main contention they want to divide people along nowadays is either sexuality or it's race. And you're not allowed to say that Jesus was white. Well, there's good reason for thinking he might be. Well, I mean, there's that image of Muhammad al-Yaqubi that we've just looked at. He's a Syrian. He's a Middle Easterner. And there's many reasons why we might indicate that Jesus was of the same sort of phenotype. If he was the guy on the Hakok mosaic, the Bar Kamsa chap, again, he's quite obviously pale-skinned and ginger. The same as Ramesses II, the same as Muhammad al-Yaqubi, the same as Cleopatra. There appears to be a strand of ginger that runs through these monarchs. And of course, I say that this Jesus character was a monarch, not a pauper prince of peace. He was a real monarch, a real king. And he would have been descended from these royal families, and therefore he would also have been pale and ginger. So, yeah, there are sound reasons for saying that. And you shouldn't dismiss people just because you don't agree with a particular proposal. Argue against it. Just don't say it's racist. You're not allowed to talk about that. Give your reasons.
Absolutely. Gnostic thinks Jesus died in AD 30.
Yeah, he does, and so do some of the other critics I have. And I'm a bit suspicious about this because they seem to be governed by the Catholic line on this, the Catholic interpretation of the Gospels, because a lot of these people were ex-Christian fundamentalists. I mean, the Gormless one was a Christian fundamentalist up until about 18 months ago. And he suddenly turned apparently turned, so he says, and become a mythicist or a historicist or whatever he happens to be now. I'm never quite sure. But they seem to be holding on to some of these ideas from their religious past, because he says that the parables in the Gospels are all correct in terms of the Catholic Christian interpretation of them, because I reinterpret them in different manner. He says, no, that's wrong. And the Catholic Church is correct. Same with, Mary being the Virgin, and Jesus being called Emmanuel. The Catholic interpretation of that is correct, apparently, according to the Gormless one. So I find that odd. So they can't, because they're so based within Catholic conformity, they can't look outside the box and see that this Jesus character might have been born in a different, well, not born in a different era, but lived and died in a different era. I won't go through this in great detail because I'm sure we've talked about this in the past in some of our talks. So we have things like Jesus talking about the siege of Jerusalem in AD 69, the death of Zacharias, which was in the AD 60s. Josephus describing a crucifixion event, which is remarkably identical to the gospel version. That happened in AD 70. There are lots of reasons for thinking that the ministry, as you might call it, of the Jesus character happened in the AD 60s. And so the dismissal of that is a bit ridiculous if you're not giving any context why you think it's wrong. Argue the case. Don't just say, he's wrong. Argue your case. Give your evidence.
I think we spoke about this many times before on previous shows, Ralph. So I'd encourage the viewers to maybe look back and
there's a few videos back in your library which you have now of this.
Okay, so the next one is Gnostic thinks Mithras came from Mithra.
Yeah, he was rather adamant about this one, and I don't know why, because there's not a great deal of evidence that Mithras came from Mithra, apart from the similar name. There is no evidence that I've seen, and none was produced in the arguments we had, that Mithra had anything to do with a guy slaying a bull. So that imagery that we have from Mithras, from Roman Mithras, of Mithras slaying the bull of heaven, because it's all contained within a zodiac, I've not seen any evidence that that has anything to do with Mithra whatsoever. I mean, this is not that important because I only mention it in a few paragraphs in my books, but it's interesting. But if we are going to connect Mithras with anything, it has more connections with Gilgamesh than it does with Mithra. Because with Gilgamesh, actually, I've got some images of this. So let's have a look at the bull slaying. If you can just bring up that image. Yeah, this is the tauroctony, I think they call it. This is Mithras slaying the bull. And notice he's got his leg bent in that peculiar fashion. And all of this is contained within a zodiac. And on the left here, we have the sun, and on the right, the moon, which is sort of indicating that this is cosmic. This is not a real king killing a real bull. This is all cosmic. Because if you look up into the night sky, oh, that's a bit small, isn't it? Let's increase that a bit. We have Orion with his leg bent in the same fashion.
Wow.
And he is slaying Taurus. This is Taurus over here. You can't see his head, but anyway, his head is just up there.
Yep.
Yeah, this is Orion slaying Taurus in the night sky. And it's still there if you want to look at it. It's it's there in the night sky. And I think this is what this is what Mithras was doing. So here's Mithras slaying the bull, and he is Orion. So Mithras is Orion, Here's Orion slaying the bull. And this is to do with procession of the equinox, because this is the same as Gilgamesh, because we can go on to this one. This is Gilgamesh. Let me make it bigger again. From the story of Gilgamesh, Gilgamesh has his club or his axe on the left here, and his bow on the right here, and hanging from his belt is a sword, and he is killing the bull of heaven, Taurus. But before Gilgamesh can kill Taurus, he has to kill the Humbaba. And the Humbaba are the seven splendors, which is not explained, the seven splendors of the Humbaba, which are quite obviously the Pleiades. Before Gilgamesh can get to the neck of Taurus, this is the neck of Taurus, he has to kill the seven splendors of the Pleiades, which is the seven sisters, the six sisters as it is now. It's a perfect description of what's going on in the heaven. Can we see it on the other image here? No, we can't see the Pleiades. Anyway, the Pleiades will be up the top here somewhere. Just on the neck of Taurus. Quite obviously, these stories are stories about, I think we've probably finished with that imagery. These stories are about the procession of the equinox, about the stars in the heavens above. And people have not seen that. So this is original research again. I think I'm the first person to ever say this about Gilgamesh, about Mithras. People have investigated Mithras, and they've looked at sort of astrological and astronomical links between Mithras and the cosmos. But I don't think anyone's come up with this bull slaying as being processional in the same fashion that I have. And they certainly haven't come up with the idea that Gilgamesh is doing exactly the same, that Gilgamesh is Orion and he's slaying the bull of heaven. I think this is all original research that has not been mentioned before. And this is what we should be doing as researchers, as historians. We shouldn't be just regurgitating what people have done before and said before. I mean, that's just ridiculous. You're not going to improve and progress in any fashion whatsoever. I hated this, well, in this line of work, but also in my science paper, where one of the reviewers said, well, where did you get this information from? And I said, well, I didn't. This is original research. This is my research. They said, oh, no, we need a reference. No, you can't have a reference because this is original research. This is the first time, as far as I know, this has ever been said. Oh, no, you can't have that. You've got to have a reference. Oh, for goodness sake. This is the way that, you know, history and science becomes ossified. We need to sort of, you know, if you disagree with it, fine. Tell me why you disagree with it. Don't just say I need a reference. And the same goes for Mithras and Gilgamesh. If you don't, this is original research. If you don't agree with it, tell me why I might be wrong. But this is interesting because if this is what I'm saying about Orion defeating Taurus, then it gives us a date. The date is 1750 BC. That is when Taurus turned into Aries, when the bull of heaven was killed and Aries, the great month of Aries, became dominant, was in 1750 BC. Now that means that Gilgamesh is much later than expected, because some people date this to like 3000 BC, the Epic of Gilgamesh. That means that the classical dating of the Gilgamesh story is 1,000 years or more out of date. It's much younger than they say. And it also means that when Mithras got to Rome, it was already well out of date by the time it got to Rome. It got to Rome in about the 1st century BC. It was already 1,600 years out of date. But they were still going along because perhaps they didn't fully understand, I don't know, that Taurus died, as it were, in 1750 BC. They should have been slaying rams, not bulls. So yeah, you can gain a lot of interesting information from this reanalysis of history. So it's interesting.
Absolutely fascinating. That I see you've just pulled up Sir Galahad, and this is the next point.
Oh
Ellis
yes,
says,
is it right?
yeah, Ellis says Sir Galahad wore a dress.
Yes. Again, someone who's not read my books to understand why I might say that, because I mean, this came as a shock to me as well. I didn't start writing this book thinking that Galahad wore a dress, but I'd already written about the galley priests of the Near East, the Galileans, as Josephus Flavius calls them, who were eunuch priests, mainly of Cybele and Attis. And like Attis, who was a eunuch, he had castrated himself. These priests used to castrate themselves. And that's why, I'm just looking up something, that's why Jesus asked for his disciples to become eunuchs in Matthew 19:12. And as he says, some of these eunuchs have made themselves eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven's sake. He that is able to receive it, let him receive it. Jesus was asking his disciples to castrate themselves. And where does this fit into Arthurian legend? Well, we have the same sect within Arthurian legend. We have the wounded king, who was specifically wounded between the thighs. He was obviously castrated. And we also have Percival, who became Galahad, because I'm sure Galahad is just a surname or a title for Percival, Sir Percival. And Percival, again, castrated himself. He was tested by the devil in the form of a woman who was trying to entice him into bed. And the only way he could get out of this was by castrating himself. It's not the only way, I would have said, but there we go. It's a fairly poor excuse for castrating.
Method, isn't it?
Yeah, a touch extreme.
Yeah.
It's almost as extreme as these soldiers in, I don't want to get off topic, but these soldiers in Ukraine, the Russian soldiers, some of them are mutilating themselves in order to get out of military service. Which is not, some people say that is not happening, but we know it happened in Rome. They used to do this in Rome as well in the later years.
I was about to say, yeah. I was about to say that towards the end of the empire, wasn't it? Parents were actually injuring their own children so they wouldn't get called up to be a soldier.
Yeah. Rome became quite woke, and they didn't want to join the army, so they used to cut their fingers off, or was it their thumbs? I think they used to cut a thumb off, because you can't hold a sword if you don't have a thumb. So people mutilating themselves is well known and established from history. So going back to the castratos, this was a well-known sect within the Near East. This is not something I'm making up. Everybody knows that they had these castratos. And the point is that Galahad might be a derivation of Gali, the Gali priests, who were eunuchs. And therefore, Galahad tends to mean an important person, a leader, a chief. So Galahad would be the chief of the Gali within the Near East, within Judea, and that Percival became a Galahad. And if he did, then he would have castrated himself, as some of the texts say that Percival castrated himself in order to get away from the devil in the form of a woman. And Josephus says that these Galli, the Galileans, wore women's dresses and women's makeup. And no, this is not just a toga. Josephus doesn't mention a toga. He mentions that they put on women's dresses that they had got from women. So this was a completely different form of dress. This was a female dress. because they were castrated. And it just I think we have a picture of this. This is an image of Cybele. I think this is supposed to be Cybele in the carriage, and of course she has a devotee or no, he's a priest because he's got a bald head, isn't he? He's got a, oh gosh, what do they call those bald heads for priests? Tonsure? Yeah, he's got a tonsure, which is a bald head for a Christian priest. But anyway, if you notice the Christian, let me zoom in a little bit. This pseudo-Christian priest is holding his balls in his hand. He's just cut off his testicles. And this is quite an early painting. This is medieval, this painting. This is not recent. So here is a priest of Cybele. He's just cut off his gules, and he's quietly bleeding here on the ground.
Oh yeah, that's mad.
Shall I? I'll zoom in a bit further. Let's see if I can zoom in a bit more. Can I move that image? There we go. He's got his testicles in his left hand.
Oh yeah. Oh wow. He seems very calm about it, doesn't he?
Yeah, very calm. He's holding the knife in his right hand that he's just cut off his gules with. So.
As you do, yeah.
Yeah, so this is medieval. I mean, this comes from this era. They knew all about it because the Crusaders had been to the Near East. They'd found out about all of these cults, because I don't think this was a cult in Europe at that time. But of course, when they went to the Middle East and the Near East, they found out all about these cults. And they would have linked this most probably with the verse from Matthew 19:12, where Jesus asks for his disciples to castrate themselves. So you could say that this is a disciple of Jesus castrating himself. They would have.
Sorry, Ralph, isn't there a comment about Peter in one of the Gospels having a high-pitched voice or words to that effect?
Yes. There is a verse that says that Peter was identified by his voice. And of course, you have to ask, why was he identified? Is that just an accent because he came from Galilee? Or was he identified through his voice because he had a high voice? Open to speculation. There is also the night meeting on the Mount of Olives, where the naked boy runs off. When the Roman guard comes to break up this meeting, there is a naked boy that slips out of the hands of Jesus, and he runs off. What was all that about? Well, I think this is what it was all about. It was a ceremony. And they were having a castration ceremony. That's why the boy was naked. And he ran away because the Roman guard arrived. And so, yeah, I think that is good evidence that Matthew 19:12 was real. He was actually doing this. They were having a ceremony to I was going to say audition. That's not what I mean. To elect the next sort of priest or high priest of the Church of Jesus and James, who would have to be a castrato, because that's what Jesus asked for, because they were following this type of religion, and they would have worn.
Sorry. Did you? Are you the first person to have brought this to the world, so to speak? The galleys being cross-dressing warriors, etc. Because I must admit, when I first heard you talking, it was with Michael Tazarian some years ago now. You told this story, and I had no idea about this whatsoever. It was all completely new to me. So, has this been mentioned before?
Not that I know of. I mean, it's in the text, of course. You only have to read the text.
Yeah,
it's in Josephus, and it's in. There's a Roman historian as well, Procopius, I think, who tells the story about how they castrate themselves during the festival. We have the verse in the Gospels, and we have the works of Josephus. So the information is all there. But of course, the information is no good whatsoever if no one ever talks about it and teaches you about it. So you could go through, being a Christian your whole life and never know that Jesus asked for his disciples to castrate themselves, because it's never brought to the fore, because it is, it's a bit like climate, isn't it? It goes against the agenda. And the agenda is that Jesus was a pauper Prince of Peace who is all love and peace, and would never mention castration in his life, and was never married, never had children, honest
Yeah.
Gov. And so you have this Christian Catholic agenda, and they won't mention it. And so people don't know about it. It's like the zodiacs. We've been through the zodiacs many times. The information is there. If you look it up, it's all online. It's in the ancient manuscripts. Josephus mentions it again. But of course, 99% of Christians will not know that the primary symbol of Judaism was the zodiac. In fact, Jews probably won't know that either.
And these are all just fascinating parts of the story. They're absolutely fascinating. I mean, although the galley thing does make me grimace a lot, I've just noticed I'm crossing my legs as we're talking at the moment. but I mean, can you imagine that in a film or something, with the galleys charging towards you with dresses and makeup, and it's almost like a Mel Brooks film or something like that, isn't it?
It would be.
It would be brilliant on film.
It
Absolutely
would.
amazing. Yeah.
Yes, because Josephus says they were armed. They kept their swords underneath their dresses. And if you want to know what their dresses look like, this is what their dresses look like. This is why I follow this through into the modern era. I'm always trying to make this research relevant. I think that this perpetuated itself into the modern era, and you will find that this is a is this a bishop? He's probably a cardinal. Anyway, whatever he is, he's still wearing a woman's dress. And he's a red dress because Sir Galahad was always the Red Knight. So Sir Galahad didn't just wear any old dress, he had a red dress. Sir Galahad would have looked like this. And so, yeah, it's not completely out of the realms of possibility that Sir Galahad looked exactly like this, that he was a priest of the Church of Jesus and James, of the Church of Cybele, although they probably didn't venerate Cybele in quite the same fashion. And they looked like this. They wore women's dresses. So again, the criticism is moot. You need to do some more investigation and not just criticize from a position of ignorance.
Okay, the next one, Ralph. Jocelyn Godwin does not make the claim I quoted.
Yeah, strange criticism, this, because this is a problem of people using other people's work to establish what they're saying. He got this from somebody else. He didn't do the research himself, because Godwin does say exactly what I said, and it's on page 28 of his book. The book is Mystery Religions of the Ancient World, and the quotation I made in my book comes from page 28. So it's there. What more can I say?
Absolutely. Okay, just to round this up now, Ralph, I'm going to put the last two together. If you could just briefly comment on them. They are ridiculous, but at the same time, disgusting allegations, I would say.
Yes.
Gnostic says you denigrate the education of black people, and Gnostic says you blamed 3 airliner crashes on female pilots.
Again, completely baseless and downright lies, because regards the extract that he showed about black education, I never wrote that. I never said that. No idea where he got that from. And then he goes on to say that I blamed 3 women on, or should I say, blamed women pilots for 3 airliner crashes. No, I did not, because all three of those particular crashes, as it were piloted by men. So he knows nothing about this particular incident. And this is where I hate this sort of criticism, because this is criticism from a point of ignorance. It's presented with venom, as if they are authorities in this field and they know what they're talking about, but they've got no idea what they're talking about. And he is presuming to tell people what Ellis has said and does, and it's completely and utterly wrong. I was complaining about flammable liquids being taken onto flight decks, which has, in my sincere opinion, caused 3 crashes with 66 people killed. Now, this is a problem of aviation safety. We should be allowed to discuss aviation safety, because people taking flammable liquids onto flight decks is dangerous, and it shouldn't be happening. But it has happened. It used to happen in Eastern countries, because they used to take ethanol on board for hand washing. It happened because lately some female pilots are bringing perfume onto the flight deck, which shouldn't be on the flight deck. And it's happening even more now. This is why I made the commentary that because of COVID, people are taking hand cleansers onto aircraft cockpits, which are high percentage ethanol again. Some of them are like 80% ethanol. And this ethanol is stored on top of the oxygen mask. And if you know anything about chemistry, you will know that oxygen and ethanol does not mix. You end up with a very combustible combination, and it will burst into flames. Doesn't help that all of these particular airlines used to smoke as well, but you don't necessarily need an ignition source. It'll burst into flames anyway if you have 100% raw oxygen there as well. And it's caused 3 very difficult, very dangerous and tragic accidents. How do I know this? Because I used to fly one of those aircraft. So I've got 200, 250 hours on the aircraft that caught fire. Okay, I wasn't there. I don't think it would have caught fire if I had been there, because I used to throw the ethanol out of the flight deck when I got on. But it was always there because everyone else carried it on. And what does it do? Well, if you just bring up an image here, this is an image of, I think this is Egypt Air 772.
Nefertiti, yeah.
Nefertiti, yes. And you can see it's burnt out. This is where the oxygen mask sits, just here, which is where people used to put these bottles of ethanol for hand cleaning. And it's burnt out that entire area. You would not be flying this aircraft if this aircraft had been in flight, because this is what the flight deck looked like.
Oh my
it
God.
burnt out the entire cockpit. That's supposed to be a cockpit. I mean, there's nothing left.
Wow.
The pilots had to evacuate that within about 30 seconds of the fire taking hold. And it's important. This is airline safety. We've got to be able to discuss this. But this was a conundrum that nobody was solving, because there is nothing in a flight deck to burn. Oxygen cannot burn. So we have an oxygen mask, which is on this side, just down here. That's your oxygen mask. Oxygen cannot burn unless it has a fuel. So what is the fuel in this fire? Well, everything that is made in a flight deck is made to be non-flammable. Otherwise, it's not allowed onto the flight deck. So what burnt? Well, if you've got 150 mil of raw ethanol sitting on the oxygen mask, that will burn. It'll burn very, very quickly. And that's why I think this is what happened. I didn't realize it when this accident happened, because this was just a report, obviously, that this had happened, and I didn't make 2 + 2 at the time. But this was the one that interested me, because this was my aircraft. I used to fly this aircraft very often. And exactly the same happened to this one. This big boom here, this was very interesting. I didn't know they had this. This is the fire brigade. And the fire brigade came along because the whole cockpit was on fire. Pilots had to evacuate the cockpit within 30 seconds. The aircraft was full of passengers. You can see the emergency exits here are open.
Yeah.
180 passengers had to go out via the slides. You can see the slides here, and there's one at the back here. They all had to evacuate. There were 27 were taken to hospital with broken legs and burns. And the fire brigade came along with this huge, great boom on the end of the fire engine and went thonk and stuck it through the top of the flight deck and pumped foam straight into the flight deck. Because obviously, if you're putting foam on the outside of the aircraft, it's doing nothing. So they actually stuck a nozzle straight through the top of the aircraft into the flight deck and pumped foam straight into the aircraft, which I had not seen before. I thought that was very interesting.
Yeah.
But yeah, so this is and I deduced this problem because I knew we had ethanol on the flight deck sitting on the oxygen mask, which is where this fire was. It was just here, first officer's oxygen mask just here. And so I put this information to the NTSB. America was involved because this was in Turkey, of course, but it was an American aircraft. So the NTSB had to come along, and they did half of the investigation. So I collared this NTSB guy on the flight back because he was on my flight, and I told him all about this problem, and he said, "Yeah, you're probably right. This is what caused these 3 accidents, which killed 66 people in total, plus the crew. So that would be 774 or more." And I was rather miffed, disgusted that in the final report, he didn't mention it. So he didn't mention the hand cleanser, which was sitting on the oxygen mask. And this is the problem with people who want to cancel you. People like Gnostic the Gormless, who want to cancel me for something I didn't actually say when I was trying to bring up a very important aviation safety matter. And he wants to cancel me for that. And that makes people not mention what they want to not say what they want to. And I think this NTSB guy was under the same sort of pressures from his management. They didn't want the blame going in that direction. And so he knuckled under and didn't put it in his final report. And that is dangerous because we're back to what they call in aviation. Aviation has always run on tombstone engineering. Tombstone engineering means that nothing gets changed in aviation unless 10 or more people die. Or in Boeing's cases, you've got to have at least 300 people die. Then they'll change something. If it's only 1 or 2 people, they won't change it. You've got to have a significant number of people die, and then they'll change the design. That's why it's known as tombstone engineering. And we shouldn't be relying on that. No. And we shouldn't have people cancelling people who are interested in aviation safety. So, yeah, that's my 3 penneth on that one.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Ralph. Right. I think because of the time now, we should probably move on to the next subject. So let's just remove that image. Now, you're off to Egypt. I believe at the end of next month. Is that correct?
Yes. Beginning of next month, I start in Turkey, and then I move across to Egypt. Yeah.
Lovely. Okay. Well, we're going to focus on Egypt today. So this is part of the Megalithomania tour that Ralph's going on. He's a guest speaker. And the first place I believe that you're going to visit is Dashur. And
yes,
Dashur, of course, is famous for a couple of pyramids. This is the Red Pyramid.
Oh, is that the Red Pyramid? It sort of doesn't look like the Red Pyramid, but yes, I imagine you're perfectly right. Yeah, the Red Pyramid, again, stripped of its casing blocks, but more or less sort of intact, I suppose.
Yeah. I'm pretty sure that's a red pyramid.
Yeah.
Yeah, I thought it was a nice picture. This
Yes.
is the bent pyramid, isn't it?
Yes, that's the bent pyramid,
Yeah.
which is right next door to it. You can walk between the two of them, so they're right next door. The
Mm,
bent pyramid is even better because, as you can see, it has most of its casing blocks still on. So you can see where they've been
mm,
pilfered on the edges,
yeah.
but the rest of the casing blocks are still on there, which shows the condition that the pyramids could have been in if they hadn't have pilfered all of the casing blocks.
Mm. Were they built roughly at the same time, Ralph? These two pyramids?
I think they were. Well, even in classical history, they are regarded as being the pyramids of Snefru or Snorfru.
Mm-hmm.
So they are said to be built at the same time. I don't believe that's true because Snorfru comes out having built 4 pyramids or something, which is highly unlikely. And I think these are megalithic. Well, they are megalithic, and therefore from the megalithic era.
Mm-hmm.
And we've already discussed why I think the megalithic era is older than is claimed.
Mm,
I think Snorfru is linked to these pyramids because he repaired them, not because he built them.
mm. Yeah, that makes sense. Next up, oh, here we are. This is the Cairo Museum. You'll be there the
Yes.
following day.
But this is the old museum, so I will be very interested because I've not been to the new museum. This is the old, you can see it's the old sort of Victorian one, built by the British long time ago.
Mm,
But I think everything now has been moved across to the new museum. So it'll
right.
be very interesting to go and see that. They've got this wonderful new sort of modern art sort of museum. So it'll be very interesting to go and see that. I presume everything now has been moved across
Yeah,
into the new museum.
brilliant. And this is
Well
the
worth visiting. Anyone that's not been there, the Cairo Museum is wonderful.
believe this is the Karnak temple.
Yes, sort of looks like it to me. So this Karnak is obviously down in Thebes. This is down in the south.
Mm,
And there are 2 temples there. There's the Luxor temple and the Karnak temple. One's big and one's smaller. The Luxor one, I believe, is the smaller of the 2.
yeah, I think
And
this is the Luxor.
most of these, yeah, most of these are actually fairly new. A lot of these are Ptolemaic.
Oh,
And so, although they have different eras as you walk through the temple, you have different layers and different eras.
mm,
But a lot of this work on a lot of these temples was actually Ptolemaic. So it's only from, maximum of like 300 BC.
mm,
But of course, a lot of these statues were reused. And so you might find these statues are original statues that they've
mm.
taken and reused.
Fascinating. Now, this is on the ceiling, I believe, of the Luxor temple. Am I correct in saying that?
Yes, probably. I don't know exactly which one this comes from,
I think it's
but
the
yes,
Luxor.
yeah, a lot of these temples still have the coloring, the
Mm,
original painting,
yeah, it's
still,
amazing.
yeah, mainly on the roof and so on, where they can't be touched so much, and
Mm,
where the groundwater hasn't peeled off the paint and so on. But
mm,
yeah, a lot of them are still painted. They were in vibrant colors. All of the pillars and the capitals on the top of the pillars, they were all colored. All of the ceilings were colored with imagery and hieroglyphics, and
mm,
they were very colorful. But mind you, you see, so were Christian cathedrals. We're conditioned to going around cathedrals and just seeing bare stone, but that's not how they were built. They were all highly colored. So if you go to Salisbury Cathedral in the south of England, it's all bare stone. But you can
mm,
see pictures because when they were doing some renovations on the front facade, and they found behind all of the figures, there's loads and loads of statues on the front facade, which would be the west facing facade, there was paint on all of these figures. So all of these figures were actually brightly painted back in the medieval era. So it would have looked very spectacular in that era.
Mm.
The paint was taken off during the Reformation, when idolatry became taboo. You weren't allowed to have idolatrous images, and so a lot of these statues were broken, and a lot of the paintwork was just covered up with lime wash and things of that nature.
Mm.
And so we lost all of the colourful interior to our churches.
That's very sad. Moving on, this is the Dendara temple.
Dendara, yes.
Yes.
Again, this is Ptolemaic, as far as I remember. I've been there a couple of times. So I visited Egypt about 4 times to actually tour.
Mm.
But obviously I've been to Egypt flying in and out and just staying there on, I don't know, couple of hundred occasions, maybe 150 occasions.
Wow.
It was one of the destinations we used to go to quite a lot. And often this was quite a long journey. You couldn't always do it as a return trip. Sometimes you had to stay there. So we used to do a lot of staying in Egypt.
Very nice. Okay. Now I believe this is very famous, and it's from the
Yes.
Dendera temple. And if you close in, you can see this is, I think it's above a doorway.
Yes.
And you can see here what looks like a helicopter, some sort of flying vehicle. And I think the official explanation for this is erosion or something like that.
No, this is a double cut. I think that there is a proper name for how you double cut something. It's a motif. It's a dedication to a king. You can see that for starters. We've got the bee and the sedge, which is the emblems of the Upper and Lower Egypt. So this is talking about a royal name. Although, is this a cartouche? Yeah, it probably is part of the cartouche. And what they've done is they've cut these hieroglyphs into the stonework. And then the king has died, the pharaoh has died, and another pharaoh has come along in a later era and usurped this hieroglyph, this cartouche. And what they've done is they've covered it with plaster. So they plastered over all of, because these hieroglyphs are actually made by cutting into the stonework. So they've plastered over all of that stonework and then recut the new name of the pharaoh. And so you get the new name. But over the next, couple of thousand years, all the plaster has fallen out. And so now you get a hyperposition, would you call it, of two sets of hieroglyphs. And you can see that here we have an arm glyph being covered up with these vertical lines with another glyph. And same with this one is an arm glyph, and it's got something else on the top of it. And same with all of these. So you get a superposition. I think that's a better word, a superposition of two glyphs put on top of each other. And because of that superposition, you get some very strange looking glyphs. And that's where we get this pattern that looks like helicopters and flying crafts and so on. So it's just two hieroglyphs superimposed one on top of the other.
Okay, brilliant. Next up, this is Abydos, Seti the First Temple, I believe.
Is it at Abydos or is it in the Valley of the King? I'm not quite sure on this one. I don't know where his burial is. It sort of looks like Valley of the Kings. So is that Seti the First?
Well, Valley of the Kings is coming up in a couple of images. So
okay, well, I'll take your word for it. I'm not entirely sure where he was buried, but this is the standard tomb going down and down and down into the bowels of the earth underneath a mountain somewhere. And most of these pillars are normally natural. So they've actually carved out all of this material in between and left the pillars there. So it's quite cleverly done with this flat roof. You've got to be very careful about flat roofs of that size. And then they plaster it over, so it's all covered with plaster, and then they've painted it. So yeah, a lot of hard, difficult work goes into making these tombs. They must have had a large team of people on this job.
Yeah. This is the Assyrian,
The
I believe.
Assyrian, yes.
Yeah.
I have never worked out what on earth the Assyrian was all about. It's a very strange place. I think we should be able to visit it on this occasion. Every time I've been to Egypt, this has been closed. So I've never been to the Assyrian, so it'll be very interesting to go there. It is megalithic, as you can see.
Impressive blockwork, isn't it?
Yeah. But the craftsmanship on these stones, because I think most of these stones in the Assyrian are all igneous rock, it's granite. And so cutting these blocks to be as flat as that with, perfect 90-degree sides to it, very, very difficult work.
I think it's only diamond, I think, that's harder to cut, if I remember rightly.
Well, you can cut it with diorite, but making it as flat as that is very, very difficult. As you can see if you go down and look at the unfinished obelisk, it's very difficult to get a flat surface like this. Very difficult to explain how they were cutting granite like this. Even if you go to the Dashur pyramids, if you go to the Bent pyramid we've just looked at, that's limestone, of course. That's Tura limestone for the casing blocks, which is relatively easy to cut. I mean, it's still a very hard limestone. But if you look at the stones, it is saw cut. So it's not a guy with an adze, chipping away at the blocks to make it into the right shape. It's actually saw cut. You can see the saw marks on it. And so, well, that's interesting because, the Egyptians in this era weren't really known for having saws. And in this era, they would only be copper saws. They weren't supposed to have had bronze in this age, and the cut marks indicate a fairly rapid rate of cutting through the rock. So they weren't just grinding the rock away. It was actually cutting through the rock with each. I'm just guessing. In fact, we'll have to take images of this, and I'll try and get some images and send them back so people can have a look at them. But fantastic. I'm guessing from the last time I saw it that each incision with a saw was going in about 1 millimeter or 2 millimeters with each cut. So as fast as we would cut, wood with a standard saw, quite impressive in
Very
terms
impressive,
of the workmanship.
Wow, that's incredible. Now this is the Colossi of Memnon.
Yes.
Now I believe that Brian Forster has suggested, or he's visited the site and says that there are clear scorching marks on the side of both of these monuments, and he's a big proponent of a cataclysm that took place, I think, about 10,500 years BC.
Yes, yes, he is. I'm not sure I'd go along with that. You can get marks on stones just because of the orientation that they're in. So you'll get more erosion on the sun side, for instance, or if there is a rainy side, which is always exposed to the weather. And so you will get differential erosion because of that. You will get patina marks on stones. Even granite will, because of you when you get the granite wet and you get water which can leach into the rock. I mean, rock is porous, all rock is slightly porous. That water can leach out minerals and recombine minerals within the rock, and you end up with a layer on the top of the rock, which is different to the rest of the granite or the limestone below. So you get this layer form on the surface. That's just normal weathering, a sort of patina, but sometimes it's fairly thick. It might be 5 millimeters thick. And depending on the rock and where it's situated and what the weather's doing, you will get these effects on the rock. So I don't think these rocks are anything to do with a cataclysm. The interesting thing I've always found with these two is they are completely different. The one on the left here is, as far as I remember, is a monolith. It's one lump of rock. The one on the right, as you can see, is obviously made up of blocks. I think what's happened with the one on the right is the bottom is monolithic, and for some reason it was damaged, and they've remade the torso and the head of this in blocks at a later time.
A bit similar to the Sphinx, I suppose.
Yeah, a lot of these statues and temples and so on, they've gone through thousands of years of change, of being, renewed, rejigged, renovated, and so you get a lot of this. And so it's very difficult sometimes to gauge what era any one statue or carving comes from, because they've been reworked so often. Ramesses II was the worst of them, of course. He's known as the Great Chiseler because he just went through Egypt and chiseled his name onto everything. So if you just went on the names, you would say half of Egypt was built by Ramesses II, Ramesses the Great. But of course, he was just chiseling his name on everything. He wasn't. He didn't build everything.
Right. I think this
looks like Karnak to me.
I was going to say the Edfu Temple of Horus.
Oh, Edfu. Yes, this is where my book company was named after Edfu, the Edfu Temple, because I happened to be there at the time when I started that particular publishing company. So I called it Edfu Books, EDFU Books. And if this is Edfu, I imagine, because they all look very similar. They've all got these same pylons on the front, so they all look very similar. Again, this will be Ptolemaic. This is not that old as far as I know. These bits here are very interesting. People might not know this, but every temple had a flagpole. So here we've got 4 flagpoles on the front, which would have been very tall, probably Lebanon cedar or something, tallest piece of wood you can get, with a flag on the top, because the image of the god was Natur, and Natur was a flag. So the symbol of the god was a flag. And of course, we don't know what the flag looked like, what was drawn on the flag. But anyway, you would have had 4 flags flying from the front of this temple, much the same as you would on any big national monument today. If you look at a palace or a parliament or whatever, you'll have exactly the same. You'll have a whole series of flags outside that particular building. And that tradition has come straight out of Egypt. That's exactly what they did in Egypt, because the flag is the symbol of God. It is a Natur, which some people translate as having come into the English as nature. I'm not entirely sure if that's true. But some people link that name up to nature in the English.
Very interesting.
Yeah, I'm not sure of the derivation of that, whether it's come through the Greek or the Latin or whatever. No idea.
This, I think, is the Temple of Ombo.
Okay, yes. Down, is that on an island in the Nile? I can't remember that one.
Is that Aswan or
yes,
the Temple of Isis, I think.
Right, yes. I don't know just from the imagery which one it is, but yeah, that's the famous one that was reconstructed down on the banks of the Nile. Never actually been to that one. So
They're
that's
absolutely massive, aren't they? These statues. And I think there's
yes.
4 of them, if I remember rightly. We're looking at 2 at the moment.
Yeah, the door is on the left-hand side, and then you've got 2 statues either side of the door. But this is just carved out. These are not statues as such, I suppose. These are just relief carvings. So these have been carved out of the bedrock, a little bit like they do in Petra. In Petra, they do the same. And this was moved. So this was in the Lake Nasser, do they call it? Is it still called Nasser? Because he's long gone, of course. Anyway, they made a dam there. The Russians made a dam for the Egyptians, and I think the lake that formed behind it was called Lake Nasser, and it was going to inundate this particular monument. So they actually dismantled it and remade it further up the side of the hill, which was quite a big undertaking because it's huge, as you say. It's an enormous. So it took an awful lot of manpower, and it was underwritten by the UN, I think, who because it was declared to be a sort of world monument. So they dismantled it.
That's just a doorway to the Nubian Museum.
Okay, yes.
That's I believe that's a Nubian or a house in a style, a Nubian style opposite the museum. And then, of course, we've got the 1,168-ton obelisk in the Aswan Quarry.
Yes, and this is granite, of course. So this is very, very difficult to carve. And I think this, contrary to what everybody else says, I think this is evidence that this was not the technique used for a lot of the other monuments and stelae and obelisks that are in Egypt. Because if you look at this thing, the workmanship on this is rubbish.
Well, there's a lot of scoop marks on the side, isn't there? If I remember rightly.
Yes, you can see them here on the left, all these little scoop marks. And the scoop marks are how you would do this in the fashion they say, with a diorite boulder. So they were saying that they were just using boulders to smash the granite and slowly wear your way down very, very, very slowly. And people have questioned why you get these scoop marks, but you would have to make a scoop mark in order to keep because you don't hit the diorite boulder on the ground. You'd end up breaking your hands if you did that all the time. What you do is you throw it on the ground like a ball and catch it again. That way you're not getting the shock of that hitting through your hands. So you're actually throwing it like I don't know, a sort of bowling ball or something, and you're throwing it at the ground and recatching it. And in order to do that, you need to make a scoop mark because you need the ball to come back to you and not fly off in some strange direction. So this might have been made in the fashion they ascribe, with diorite pounders just pounding away, thousands of workers over many years, over many centuries maybe, pounding away to form this enormous great obelisk. But this is not the way the other obelisks and the other things like the Osirian we saw were manufactured, because their standard of workmanship is 1,000 times better than this. And so I think this is actually man-made in the normal fashion, as they say, but the other megaliths, like you see in the Osirian, were manufactured in a different fashion because their quality is so much better than this.
Yeah.
And of course, this was left there because it cracked, so there was no point taking out. And even if you can just go back to that, I've seen people in the modern era cut a block, okay, not as big as this, maybe half the size of this. I've seen workmen in the modern era cut a block half the size of this in 1 week. through the technique of putting little holes, because if you go out elsewhere, this is in the Great Quarry down it's in the south. It's near Karnak and Thebes. The Great Granite Quarry. What do they call it? The Quarry of Aswan or something. Anyway.
Yes, the Aswan Quarry. Yeah.
Aswan Quarry. And you will see lots of little cut marks. So if you go elsewhere around the quarry, you'll see lots of little cut marks made in the granite, and then a lump missing. And that's what they do in the modern world. If you don't have modern machinery, of course, what you do is you cut a whole load of little holes all the way down this piece of rock that you want to cleave and cut. And then you put little chisels all the way down in each one of those little cuts. You put a chisel. So you might, in a piece this long, you might end up with like 500 chisels all stuck in the rock. And you just hit them. And you have a whole team of people just going along hitting them. And eventually the whole thing splits in two. And it splits very accurately. If you're a professional, if you're good at your job, if you know how the granite grains are organized, you can cut it in a certain fashion. And you can see these guys just hammering away, and it will cleave itself. So you don't need to pound it like this, for decades or centuries. You can cleave it. And so whoever was trying to make this enormous, great, unfinished stela didn't understand how you could work granite. And you'll see that happening up in Giza as well. If you look at all the granite blocks that were on the bottom of the second and the third pyramid, mainly on the second pyramid, when the casing blocks were taken off, which was during the Muslim era, and they wanted to use the granite blocks because they wanted to use them in Cairo for building projects, and they had this enormous great lump of granite, which probably weighed, I don't know, 10, 20 tons or so, which was far too big to be used in a building. And so they did exactly the same. They put lots of little holes across the top of it. They put chisels in it and broke it off. And you can see all those little chisel marks in the top of the stone. So, yeah, I don't think there's anything special about this unfinished obelisk. I think this was made by people who didn't understand how you could cut stone.
Well, that's a very interesting idea and one I've not come across before. So thanks for that.
No, people don't sort of mention this, but you've only got to go around the rest of this particular sorry, I was going to knock myself off there. You can go around the rest of this quarry and you can see where people have used this technique elsewhere in the quarry. So in later eras that has been used. And if you go around all of the real megaliths, like the King's Chamber and so on within the Great Pyramid and all of the other places where they've used enormous great granite slabs, they're not made like this. They are of much, much better quality. They are almost perfect. So they weren't using this methodology. There is a clear difference between the two.
Yeah. Okay. Now this is the what's it called? The Naya Plateau. I've not written it down. It's a stone circle in the middle of nowhere in Egypt, very remote. And I believe they've at the Nubian Museum, they've either got a replica of it or they've actually moved the real ones to the museum.
Right.
So have you heard? I'm trying to think of the name of it. It's a purportedly it's supposed to be the oldest stone circle potentially in the world. It's in southern Egypt.
Okay.
Naya Plateau, something like the name escapes me at the moment. It's something similar to that. But I believe there's either a replica of it or they've actually transferred the stones to the museum.
So is this supposed to be older than Göbekli Tepe?
I can't remember exactly, but I know it's supposed to be. I'm sure. I think Robert Bivall did a special on it many years ago. I saw it many years ago, and it took several days to get there.
Yes.
Literally in the middle of nowhere. and I think it's at the Nubian Museum now.
Right.
So,
This is the trouble with some of this investigation. It's very difficult to do sometimes because, yes, these places are remote and difficult to get to. I've been trying to arrange to go to Tanis, which is not actually that remote, but because it's classed as being in a dangerous location in Egypt, you need the army as a backup. So you've got to
wow.
take military down with you as well. So
Didn't
they're
you go
not
there
always.
once before, Ralph? And you were the only
Yes,
person there on that occasion?
yes, I was
It
the only.
must have been pretty special.
Nobody goes to Tanis because it's a little bit
Mm,
out of the way in the north of Egypt, and of course you need all of these. You need to take along a guard with you. Or I had a team of 3 motorcycle outriders that came up with us to Tanis,
yeah.
and so it makes it slightly more expensive. It's difficult, and people don't go there, and yet it's a great site.
Mm,
And yes, I've not been down to this one in Nubia either.
mm,
These stones don't look terribly worked to me. It looks like they've just chosen stones and thrown them in the ground, if this what
mm,
it looks like. So there's not as much work as even sort of Stonehenge or anything, or even Göbekli Tepe, where the stones have been worked a great deal more than this.
mm.
So I don't know much about this site.
Okay, we'll move on. That's the Saqqara Pyramid, I believe.
Okay, this is the step pyramid, is it? It I'm just trying to remember where it has facing blocks like this. I don't think the Saqqara one has facing, unless this is modern that they've put this on later. But
Ah,
that
hold
looks
on.
original,
Sorry, this might be the Unas Pyramid,
right?
Unas,
Okay.
and
So
yeah.
this is one of the fifth dynasty pyramids, where what they did is they made these pyramids of almost like mud brick and so on, and very rough stones in the center, and then put some cladding on the outside of it.
Mm,
They weren't very big. They weren't megalithic. All of these blocks, well, okay, they might be impressive, you might say, but none of these blocks are going to weigh more than sort of 10, 15 tons.
mm,
They are workable by hand fairly easily.
mm,
So these are quite explainable in normal terms of how to build these pyramids, and they weren't actually that big.
mm.
Yes, this is the step pyramid at Saqqara. Yeah.
Yeah, that's the Saqqara Pyramid. Yeah.
Yeah, this is the Saqqara one. Again, this is only made of very small bricks, very easy to make. Well, okay, time consuming because it's fairly big, but easily made without any resort to esoteric explanations because it's
Mm,
just made of bricks. And
mm,
it's also made over many generations. It doesn't look like it here, but if you sort of section it through the middle, you will see that there have been many renditions of this pyramid where it's grown and grown and grown as successive pharaohs have made it bigger and bigger and bigger.
Oh well, in a way that reminds me a little bit of the Glastonbury tour, because perhaps that was built over a long period of time and it's gradually got built bigger as time's gone on.
Yes, what you mean, the castle, the sort of church tower on the top of the tor,
Well,
or do you
no,
mean the hill itself?
the actual structure, the whole structure. It's there's about 7 tiers, isn't there? Which is kind of like what we're looking at now, and it was kind of developed
Yes,
over a long period of time, as you were just saying.
but I'm not sure how natural that would be. I've not really studied the Glastonbury tour, but I know things like Herodium or Tekoa, as it's known, just south of Jerusalem.
Mm,
If you go there as a tourist, they will say it's man-made, but it's not. If you walk up through, because there is a tunnel runs up through this mountain, and you can see strata there, and you can see flint strata within the limestone. So
mm,
quite clearly, it is natural. It's a natural mesa. But what they've done is they've shaped it, so it's been man-shaped rather than
mm,
man-made.
Mm,
And that's a rather different prospect. It's much
mm,
easier to shape a mountain than it is to physically build it.
mm,
So I wonder if Glastonbury is a bit the same, that
mm.
someone has shaped it into the position
Yeah.
that it
Okay.
looks like now.
Yeah. Now this is the Serapeum, and this is one of the places I'd most like to visit in Egypt. I find this
Yes.
place absolutely incredible.
Mm,
And we've got these huge blocks of stone,
yes.
beautifully
And
carved. Go on, sorry.
see the workmanship on these
It's incredible.
in comparison with the unfinished stelae,
And I
the
believe I'm right in saying,
unfinished.
Ralph, that they're about 100 foot underground. Is that correct?
There is a large number of these enormous great sarcophagi. So this is a sarcophagus made in granite, or even harder than granite, um, perfectly finished. You can see how smooth, um, how rectangular it is. It's well made. And then notice the inscribing on it, which has been done with a rusty nail. So quite clearly,
Mm,
and this happens on a lot of these sarcophagi down there, quite clearly the inscriptions are nothing to do with the box.
mm,
Again, these have been usurped by later pharaohs, and they've drawn their imagery, their cartouches on it and whatever in much later eras. So
mm.
most of these have been usurped. This is not original.
Have you visited the Serapeum before,
No,
Ralph?
it's always been closed. It was closed all the way during the 90s and so on, so I wasn't able
Wow.
to go there, and in the noughties. And it's open now, and it's on our itinerary, so I hope
Mm,
we'll be able to get in there. But yeah, it's a fascinating place. These boxes are supposed to have been used, so they think, for the mummification of sacred bulls. And if that's true, then that might give us an idea of when this was in use, because
mm.
the era of the
Taurus.
Apis bull would have been 4,500 BC through to about 1750 BC,
Mm, mm,
the age of Taurus.
mm,
Um, but again, the boxes might have come from any era before that. You've got
mm,
no idea, because you can't go on the inscriptions on them. It's like if up in Tanis, if you look at the wonderful granite pillars that they have up in Tanis, which are sort of palm leaf um, pillars made of Aswan granite, red granite, and they're
mm,
absolutely perfect and they're absolutely wonderful. And then Ramesses II and various other pharaohs have cut their cartouche on the top of it.
mm,
And you can tell that this is from a later date, because the cartouche very clumsily goes through the artwork on the top of the pillar. And I can't imagine any artisan would put this wonderful um, beading and collars on the top of the pillar and then clumsily cut a cartouche through it.
mm,
So again, these cartouches they're much more recent, and they've been cut into a much more ancient pillar, which could be of any age, because we cannot date stone. And I was
mm,
interested in these pillars because I've never come to any particular conclusion on this, but you'll find these pillars are eroded on one side and not on the other. And how long does it take to erode a um, a granite pillar? Granite is very resistant. I mean,
mm,
you can leave it out in the open for an awful long time, and it won't erode in the fashion that it has. And yet they've eroded on one side. And you
mm,
think, well, how long has that pillar been sitting somewhere? You know,
mm,
probably facing the sun in one particular direction and not the other. The other side's in shadow, perhaps,
mm,
and that it's eroded on one side.
mm.
No answer to that. Yes.
Very interesting. Okay, we're coming towards the end now. We're almost there. The final day of the tour, you're at the Giza Plateau.
Giza. Back to
Yeah.
Giza.
Um,
Yes.
what's that? What's that big door they've put across the front there, Ralph? What's all that about?
Oh, this is the Dream Stela. So this is it's just a stela. It's a piece of rock, and it has used to have an inscription from Tuthmosis III, was it? Who inscribed this, saying, I found you the Sphinx, and you were covered in sand, and I promised the gods I would free you from the sands, and so on. And that shows us that the Sphinx has been covered with sand for many centuries in its whole existence. And that's part of the arguments about how much erosion you can get on this. If it's always been covered in sand, why is it eroded so much? It sort of might suggest that it's older. The other thing I like about this and this imagery, you'll see the face is a different piece of rock. So this is strata 3. This is strata 2, which is much softer. This is a much harder piece of stone on the top, which is natural to this area. You do get these different strata, 1, 2, and 3, of different limestones, and the third one here is much more resistant, much harder. And it's one of the few pieces of this number 3 strata that is still left here. And what is the chances of this piece of stone being in exactly the right position to form the head of the Sphinx? I think it's highly unlikely, because the Sphinx is in a particular position. It's at the bottom of the second pyramid causeway, facing due east. It's in a particular position in relation to the rest of the Giza pyramids. And the chances of this piece of stone being in that region at that could be cut into the head of the Sphinx, I think is highly unlikely. So I think what they must have done is they must have dragged this into position before they cut out the body of the Sphinx.
Wow.
And that would be difficult, because this is a huge piece of rock. This must have weighed over 2,000 tons before it was carved into the shape of the head. And that would be one of the biggest stones we've ever seen that has been moved into position.
That's incredible. We could probably do a whole show on the Giza Plateau at some point.
Yes, there's a lot of information to come from that.
A really, really good one. And last but not least, we've got the Great Pyramid. You'll have, I think you've got 2 hours in there with the group, at least 2 hours on the day.
I know, it's not enough.
Yeah. How many times have you been inside the Great Pyramid?
Twice. I've been in twice. Yeah.
And what was your first experience like? Can you describe how you felt, and what was it like?
Well, it didn't feel like a tomb. I mean, you've got all of these microscopic passageways that go down to the bottom and then up to the Queen's Chamber and the King's Chamber, which are made for troglodytes. And if I was making a tomb, I would not do that. I mean, that's not what they did when they made the tombs of the in the Valley of the Kings. They made proper passageways, so you could take the mummy and whatever, down through the passageways, have a bit of a procession, people there lining the passageway as the mummy was taken down in its sarcophagus, all that sort of stuff. All covered in hieroglyphs and cartouches and colored. And of course, none of that is there in any of these pyramids. The mummy could not have been taken down these passageways and into these chambers. You would really have to put the sarcophagus in there first. I can't see any way that the plug blocks in the Great Pyramid that go up to the Queen's Chamber and the King's Chamber could have been put in there afterwards. I think they would have to be put there in advance, in which case there is no way of getting the mummy into those particular chambers. You'd have to put the mummy in the sarcophagus, in the chamber, and then build the rest of the pyramid up around it. I see no way of getting around that problem. They've put scenarios for these plug blocks to be slid down the grand gallery into their position. I just don't think that's tenable to block off the end of that particular passageway. It doesn't give the feeling of being a tomb in any shape or form, which is why I don't think they are tombs. Of course, no sarcophagus, no mummy has ever been found in a pyramid. So we're fairly certain that these were not tombs. These were cathedrals to the cosmos, to mathematics, various other things. You see some people here sitting on the top of the Great Pyramid. We know this is the Great Pyramid because this is flat on the top. It's got a flat top in it. That's the second pyramid. You can see it's got a little bit of the casing blocks still remain on the top of it.
Yeah.
And I have a suspicion that the Great Pyramid was always flat topped, that it was always unfinished.
Not heard that before.
Yeah, I think a few people have had this idea because I think it was used as an astronomical viewing point.
Oh, okay.
You can see the view you get. This is Cairo in the distance here with all the lights. You can see the view you would get of the heavens while standing on the top of the Great Pyramid. This would be the best astronomical viewing point in the whole of Egypt, because Egypt doesn't have any mountains, of course. This would be absolutely perfect. And it may well have had a set of steps going to the top. There's various reasons for thinking that, because, you know, I say, of course, that this is Mount Sinai. And of course, they walked up the side of Mount Sinai to get to the chamber to go and see, you know, the chamber where God lived. It's quite possible that the Great Pyramid had a set of steps up the side of it. Strabo mentions the entrance, and that people were using that entrance, the original entrance, not Mamun's entrance.
Wasn't there supposed to be a spiral staircase originally in the middle of or inside the pyramid?
I don't think so. Some people have proposed that. I've not seen any evidence that that is true, but there could have been a spiral staircase on the outside of it. In fact, there could have been a straight staircase to the top, but that would have been fairly precipitous. It would have been a very scary to get to the top of it, because it goes up at, you know, quite a steep angle. I propose there might have been a spiral staircase on the outside of it, going round and round and round and ending up at the top. Because all the casing blocks have been taken away. So you would have no real evidence of whether there was a staircase there or not, because all the evidence has been removed. But when Strabo says that the original entrance was known about, and there was a stone on that entrance which you could lift up and go down into the descending passageway, that rather suggests that there were steps going up to that entrance, unless they had put a whole load of scaffolding for people to actually go up to that original entrance. Which is possible, I suppose. If you look at the Bent Pyramid, they have an entrance on the east side, is it? There's two entrances on the Bent Pyramid. There's the low one, which is fairly easy to get into, which is where you get into it nowadays. And there's one high up on another side of the pyramid. It's beyond the bend here in the Bent Pyramid. There's an entrance way up on one side of the Bent Pyramid, and it's just there in the side of the pyramid. There's nothing really to identify it, you know, apart from the fact that the door is missing now, so you can see a sort of dark hole. But there's certainly no steps on this one, and there's just this entrance. It's in the middle of nowhere. You would have to have an enormous great set of ladders to get up to it. So we don't know is the answer, but I have a sneaking suspicion that there were some steps carved into the casing blocks that went up the side of the Great Pyramid.
There we are. Okay, so that was absolutely fascinating as always, Ralph. Very, very grateful to you. We're approaching the 3-hour mark now, so yeah, you should probably go and save your voice for another time. And yeah, really, really enjoyed that. Thank you so much. If you made it to the end, well done.
I did without losing my voice. Glad to be on your show again. It's always good to be here. Yeah, and yeah, if I can get some snippets of information when we go on the tour, I'll pass them on back.
Oh, that'd be brilliant, mate. Be really grateful to you for that. Cheers, Ralph. Okay, please like, share, subscribe, everyone. We'll see you again. Thanks very much.
Thanks. Bye-bye.